Over the last 3 decades, I've traveled extensively in South and Central America, and I've noticed that the deceased dictator Fidel Castro from Cuba is viewed as a hero by many in Latin America, even by many young Christians. And Pinochet from Chile was seen as a villain, a horrible dictator. Both men were brutal dictators, but much of the Latin world and the Western intelligentsia have viewed Pinochet and Castro very differently. Why? Upon his death, the Western world praised Fidel Castro from Cuba as a remarkable hero and man of the people. On the 10th of January 2017, the Venezuelan delegation to the United Nations Human Rights Council asked the Council to stand in a moment of silence as a tribute to Fidel Castro. Now, this was the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. Why would the Human Rights Council of the United Nations pay tribute to a brutal dictator? Why would anyone want to honor Fidel Castro, who turned his island nation into a prison? Over the years, Freedom House has judged the freedom of nations on a scale of 1 to 7, 7 being the least free and 1 the most free. At the time of his death, Fidel Castro's Cuba was rated at 6.5 out of 7 on the Freedom of the World report. This is a country that clearly is not free. And yet Cuba has been a member of the venerable Human Rights Council for most of the last decade. Why would Venezuela, with a score of 5.5 on the same Freedom of the World scale, one of the great abusers of human rights, as we're witnessing today, even beyond the Council? On the other hand, since its inception in 2006, there's only been one time when the majority of the 47 members of the Council were free nations, as listed by Freedom House. The rest of the time, a majority of members have had abusive civil and political rights records. Recently, Saudi Arabia, with one of the worst human rights records in the planet, joined the Council. Perhaps this is why the members of the Human Rights Council stood to honor Castro, because Cuba was ranked not free from 1973 until the present day, and thus a model for most of the members on the Human Rights Council. Let's compare these two dictators, Pinochet of Chile and Castro of Cuba. It is acknowledged that Pinochet, during his reign, murdered between 1,200 and 3,200 Chileans. 80,000 were forcibly interred, 30,000 tortured. Under Castro, it's estimated between 10 and 100,000 Cubans were killed, 3,615 were executed by firing squads, and 1.5 million Cubans fled this so-called workers' paradise. Among those, it's estimated that between 75 and 100,000 died fleeing Cuba. Why is Castro honored and other dictators, including Pinochet, so vilified? The left, whether in the West or in the South, is much more defined by what they are against than what they're for. Anyone who is anti-American or against free markets is a hero to the left. They can ignore Castro's political and civil rights abuses writ large because he stands foursquare against the U.S. and free political and economic systems. Western academics, politicians, media, and entertainers are committed to socialism and statism and thus celebrate Castro and his political and cultural son, Hugo Chavez of Venezuela. These are the same people that Malcolm Muggeridge writes about in his profound essay, The Great Liberal Death Wish. These are the battle lines between the idea of free and self-governing people and a powerful state that has the ability to solve social and economic ills. Fidel Castro is hailed as the world's greatest revolutionary icon, except that he did not support a revolution in Cuba. His whole regime created a police state to keep the people in chains. Castro wanted an independent path for Cuba, not a subservient state under the heavy influence of the United States. Castro chose the authoritarian political system and planned economy of the distant Soviet Union as his model, rather than the political and economic freedom of the much nearer United States. What Castro and Pinochet have in common with other tyrants is that they suppressed opposition and enslaved and, if necessary, murdered their people. But Castro is separated from other tyrants in that he left his people poorer and less free. Professor Walter Russell Mead writes, Lee Kuan Yew, Augusto Pinochet, Francisco Franco, Chiang Kai-shek, Paul Chung-hee, all of these dictators and authoritarians can mock Fidel Castro. They left their countries better off than they found them. And while many of them committed terrible crimes, they can also point to great accomplishments. Fidel has only the crimes. The main signature of Castro's legacy is free healthcare and literacy. Castro has trained medical doctors and sent them all over the world to build bridges of friendship. But the legacy of literacy is hollow indeed. There are few books to read in Cuba because they are seen as filled with subversive ideas. Librarians are often imprisoned as promoting free speech and thought. Jonah Goldberg writes, "At least when people note that Hitler built the Autobahn and Mussolini made the trains run in time, they're usually being ironic. To listen to some Castro defenders, you'd think the scales of justice can balance out any load of horrors so long as the substandard healthcare is free and the schools allegedly teach everyone to read." When I visited Cuba a few years ago, I heard a joke more than one time. It went this way. Before Castro, 100 families controlled the wealth of Cuba. After Castro came to power, one man controlled all the wealth. His wealth at the time of his death was nearly $1 billion. The perpetual army fatigue-clad friend of the peasants owned a private island and a personal yacht. Yes, there are striking similarities between Castro and Pinochet. Both left thousands dead and imprisoned. Both were cruel dictators. But there, the comparison ends. Castro has frozen his country in the 1960s. His people in relative poverty. Pinochet bears the responsibility of great suffering and poverty, but in the end left his country a more free and prosperous nation than Fidel's Cuba.